Hey guys, this is Purdyjo, and this is the third video in building a game with Unity. What we're going to do in this one is basically just make some weapons for your character, and I'm going to show you how gizmos in Unity work. So we'll just get started right now. I usually keep my stuff organized, so I'm creating a weapons folder. Make a new C# script called weapon, and we're also going to make two other scripts. One is going to be called base entity, which will be what your main character and your enemies derive from. And we're going to have another script called projectile. Alright. First, we'll start with base entity, just to get things going. Alright. So first things first, I'm going to create some protected variables for the health and its maximum health. Set it to 100, and protected float max health is 100. Now, in order to access these variables from other classes, we're going to make them read-only. And nice little fancy feature that C# does is basically, I'll just show you. Alright, so what this does is, in any other script that accesses base entity, you will not see mHealth, purely because it's protected. Now, what you will see is current health, and it will return whatever mHealth is equal to, and you cannot give it a value, making it a read-only variable. If we wanted to, we could either just turn this back to public, or in here, we would just go set mHealth equals value. But we're not going to need that. And let's do the same for max health. Alright. For right now, we won't need any of this stuff. We're just getting this script ready for the next tutorial, basically, or for our next steps. So what we're going to do first is create a function called take damage. We're going to make it a virtual function. That way we can override it and still use some of the features of it. And we're just going to subtract the amount and check if the player dies. Or check if the object dies. Health less than or equals 0. Die. which will be a function we create. And we'll do something similar for heal damage. And we're just going to make sure that it does not go past max health. Simple enough. And we do not want this function to be called outside of this class. Because we don't really have any reason to call it at all, unless the object's health is 0. So this is a good starting point for this script. We really don't need much more. At this point anyways. So open up our projectile and our weapon script. Open projectile. Alright. Let's start with the projectile. We'll do the weapon last, just so I can show you the gizmos and not have any sort of distraction afterwards. Alright. So we're going to do something similar with what we did with base entity. Except for speed and its movement direction and all that kind of stuff. So speed, max speed, movement direction, which is a vector 3. Acceleration. Damage. A lifespan. And a type, which is just going to keep track of what basically what type of object fired this projectile. That way we can check and see basically if we should be doing damage to the object it collides with or not, because we don't really want enemies to be shooting other enemies. That's just dumb. And in order to use type, we need to change something up here. We just need this use system. And we'll just fill in these two. Okay. Alright, now that we have that going, we'll just set up a few things and start. Movement direction will be just the forward, so equals transform dot forward. We'll make sure, before we move on, we need to have a collider attached to each projectile. That way we can tell whether or not it hit something. And in order to do that, without having to manually bring it in the editor, we're going to use something called require component. And what this does is, if we drag the projectile script onto something, it will automatically add a sphere collider. And we can't remove it until we remove the projectile. Simple enough. And since we have this sphere collider attached to it now, we're going to find it. And make sure it's a trigger. Because if it's not a trigger and an enemy shoots another enemy, it's going to screw some stuff up. So this way it'll just pass right through. And after that, we will start a coroutine called kill. And a coroutine is just an object or a function that is called on a completely different thread, and it's good for using timers or something that only needs to be called, say, once every 5 seconds. So, in order to use an enumerator, the function needs to, in order to use a coroutine, the function needs to return an I enumerator. And what we can do here is yield return new wait for seconds, and then put in our lifespan, and then destroy this object. So after 10 seconds, no matter what, this projectile gets destroyed. Alright. Now, in our update function, all we're going to do is just make sure the projectile moves in its movement direction constantly. So, transform.position plus equals movement direction times speed times time.delta time. If you remember from the last video, this makes sure that no matter what the frame rate is, it will move at, say, 20 units per second. And to make sure that it's accelerating properly, if your speed is less than your max speed, accelerate. And also, another thing I like to do, on top of this coroutine, if the renderer is off the screen, so if renderer is visible, we destroy the object. That way we don't have random projectiles floating in space that we can't even see, just taking up memory and processor. Alright, so we have two more functions to put in. This one will be public void set instigator, and we will pass it a base entity. And we will set instigator type to instigator.getType, and that should be good. And on trigger enter, so when we collide with an object, we will create a variable for other object, and we will find the base entity component. This is purely just so that there's less typing, and it's actually more efficient to just store this in memory. So if other object is not equal to null, so this will ignore a projectile passing through another projectile, that kind of stuff. And now we're going to check the types of the other object to the instigator. So other object get type. If it's not equal to the instigator type, other object take damage, and then destroy this object. There. So that should be good for our projectile. And now comes the weapon. I use gizmos in this, which is just something in the editor. Basically, it's something visual in the editor that can help you find the direction it's pointing or where the object is without even having anything selected. If you have, say, something that's invisible but it's in the world doing something, you can give it a gizmo so that you can see it no problem at all while you're in the editor. These gizmos will not show up while you're playing your game. Alright, so for our weapon, we're going to create a couple variables. So we're going to have a projectile, and that'll call it bullet type, and then you have a a float, that is the fire rate, and we'll default it at 1. And we'll have another float, actually have a bool for lock rotation. This will be more for enemies, not so much the player. Then we're going to create some private variables. Quaternion for the starting rotation. This will be used with this object here. And a base entity, which is the owner. Alright, now onDraw gizmos is what we're going to use to show this object in the editor, because all a weapon really is just a position that projectiles spawn from. You don't need anything beyond that, really. So we go gizmos.drawSphere at this position, and the radius we'll just set to 0.1. And do another gizmo, draw a line from this position to say half a unit in front of us. So transform.position plus transform.forward times 0.5. Alright, so I'll show you what the weapon does right now, or what the gizmos will do. So I'm going to create a new empty game object and drag our weapon script onto it. And now we have this sphere. If you zoom in, there's a line pointing at the direction that it is facing. And so basically, we can attach this object to the main character. Where did you go? There we go. Alright. So we'll just put a couple weapons on. Duplicate. And you see that no matter what, we know which direction the weapons are facing. Alright. So back to the code. Alrighty, so in start, we need to check and make sure that someone put something in bullet type. Because if we don't have a bullet type, what are we going to shoot? So bullet type is set to null, and we will break so that we cannot move on until we fix it. And our starting rotation will be our rotation And we'll create a function called enable weapon. That way we can enable and disable weapons whenever we want from another script. Alright. Now we're going to create another coroutine called fire weapon. And we're just going to spawn a projectile at whatever rate our fire rate is. And we know that this weapon is going to be attached to a base entity. So we're going to grab that component. And while true, we'll make an infinite loop. If owner is on the screen, if we have our location or our rotation locked, we'll make sure our rotation is set to the same. And we will spawn a new projectile. Instantiate bullet type at our position and our rotation. Alright, and we will set the instigator to our projectile so that it knows not to kill us. And we will yield return, new wait 4 seconds, fire rate. And we'll create an else. We're going to check and see if this object is on the screen, basically every frame. Alright, so if the object is not on the screen, we'll just wait and then check again. And if it is, we'll fire the weapon. Alright, so public void, this is our enable weapon function. And it's pretty basic. It's just our coroutine fire weapon. And make sure that the script is enabled. And then we have another function called disable weapon, which we were just going to stop the coroutine. You have to pass it a string. So fire weapon, and we will disable this script. Alright. And that should be good for this script. So we'll just create our prefabs for the weapon and for the projectile. and we should be good to go. So we'll create a cube for the projectile, and we'll scale it down because that's pretty massive. So we'll go 0.1, 0.1, 0.1. And since the projectile requires a sphere collider, we will remove the box collider and we will attach the projectile to it, and we automatically get our sphere collider. And we'll make sure that this is a trigger. Alright. And that should be it for our projectile, really. So we'll create a new prefab, call it projectile, and we'll drag our cube onto it and delete. And we'll create another new prefab called weapon, and we'll just drag one of our attached weapons to it. And alright. And we'll just throw it on here. We'll make sure the weapon's attached to the character. We will also add our base entity script to the main character. We also need to remember to set our bullet type to projectile. Alright, and this should be good to go. And maybe I'll make those projectiles bigger, it's pretty hard to see. Let's go 0.5. Alright, and there you go. We now have a weapon attached to our main character. Yay! And that's pretty much it, really. Very basic. You don't really need to go overboard with your weapon script because, like I said, it's just a position that we spawn projectiles at. Nothing else. So for our next tutorial, I believe I'm creating enemies, and I'm going to show you how to use the animation editor. And I'm sure that'll be a nice long tutorial. And hopefully I'm a little more exciting than I was this time, because I was getting bored of myself. So this is Purdyjo signing off, and have a good one, guys.